This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
One of the consistent things that we get as critiques, for those of us who talk about issues in the church from the traditional side of things, is that we don't talk about good news very often. Aside from there not being very many people who want to hear good news, I've noticed that, and I don't know why that is, there also isn't just that much good news to be had. And I've reported on this before, but now I have another source on this story, and so let's get a refresher if you want some good news. Those wacky hippie generation priests, and I don't mean that in the generation sense, because their thought process definitely lasted a lot longer than the generation of hippies was around for, in terms of in the power structure of the church and broader society. But priests who think like them, the ones who in the chaotic years of the 70s and 80s were happy to dance around with tambourines and acoustic guitars and have quite literally papier-mâché puppet masses and all the rest of that stuff. The priests responsible for that, their ideological fellow travelers, they're not going to be around much longer, and I don't mean that in like a ghoulish sort of way. I mean that there are now signs that the younger priests want nothing to do with that. That we are going to have at the very least conservative priests, if not traditionally minded priests. The future looks much brighter at your parish level, if you just hold on, than it does for the modernists, the ones who want the actual gospel replaced with a social work gospel, with a material works gospel. If you're concerned about the gospel being preached on Sundays, and every single day that you might go to Mass, if you are concerned with the liturgy being offered in a way that's fitting for the holy sacrifice of the Mass, if you're concerned about the possibility that your priest may never want to offer the traditional Mass when inevitably Traditionis Custodes is rescinded, you don't need to worry too much about that going forward. Those running the seminaries are very worried right now because their young crops of seminarians are far more conservative, and not just politically. They're far more conservative than many of their current priests are, especially the older ones. So we go now to Zenit for this headline. According to the New York Times, progressive priests have no generational replacement in the American clergy. That is a big statement. No generational replacement. Yes, there are still, we'll call them classic modern Jesuits. Men like James Martin and Thomas Reese and others, they're still those kind of men to some degree in the priesthood, but they're going to be the exception in the not distant future in the church in the United States and in Western Europe, and probably in Latin America as well. It used to be that young priests, seminarians, would have to keep their devotions to themselves, including the rosary, that if they prayed the breviary more than they were required to, that if they were outwardly too pious, or if they had Catholic opinions about certain hot-button topics, they'd get in trouble for it. Some of them being dismissed from the priesthood or the seminary for being too rigid. I've received testimonies from former seminarians on this. I've received testimony from priests who had to keep their head down in the Novus Ordo seminaries to get through because they were too conservative. My suspicion is that that doesn't work anymore, because if they dismissed all of these men, their seminaries would drop by like 95%, and they can't have that. The vocations crisis has resulted in something. They cannot keep the conservatives out anymore. This is good news for those of you hoping the crisis in the church takes a turn for the better soon. Here are the details from the article. Quote, priests who describe themselves as progressive in theological ideas are almost irrelevant in number, if compared to those inclined to the official doctrine of the Church. According to a survey, 3,500 priests of the United States prefer orthodoxy. Michael Sean Winters, former seminarian and columnist of the National Catholic Reporter, considers himself a progressive Catholic and states that, quote, there are fewer liberals with numerous families in the Church. Moreover, parents with more children generally rejoice at new vocations arising in their families. In November 2023, the Catholic Project published the conclusions of a national study of Catholic priests carried out with the Catholic University of America, which interviewed 10,000 priests about priest tendency and their positions according to age. The study showed a significant division between the political and theological identification of older priests and the younger. The data points out that the portion of new priests that see themselves as politically liberals or theologically progressives is constantly decreasing and has practically disappeared. More than half of those ordained since 2010 were inclined to orthodoxy, and none of those ordained since 2020 defined themselves as, quote, very progressive, seeing themselves politically as moderates or conservatives. The majority of the elderly priests regarded themselves as politically liberal and theologically progressive. The analysis of Michael Sean Winters, specialized in religious information, stresses, quote, the Catholic liberal priest in the United States could be extinguished in the near future. The survey's data states that the progressives in their day, 68% of the ordained, hardly represent 1% today. The reflection on the report opines that Vatican II and the 2002 Ted McCarrick problem marked the change in tendency. End quote. We'll get you some more details here for what separates this piece from the last time I reported on this. This is not surprising. The progressive Catholic families don't have large families. I feel like I just said the sky is blue. Okay? That's how obvious this is. The more traditionally minded families tend to have more kids. And traditionally minded Catholics rejoice that they can give to our Lord servants for the vineyard. This is not surprising. And then you factor in something else that they didn't mention. The growing traditional Catholic movement, because it has been growing, and it exploded after Summorum Pontificum in 2007. The growing movement of younger people being attracted to tradition, getting married and living the same way that all of our ancestors as Catholics did until about 60, 70 years ago, is contributing to this without question. Granted, young person who was married in 2006, 2007, 2008, who was part of that early wave of this or later, their kids are not going to be seminarians yet, obviously, unless they already had kids before they became traditionalists. But this isn't going to help them reverse this. The vocations in the church are largely coming from the traditionally minded, whether they're traditionally minded Catholics in the ordinary foreign parishes or they're traditionally minded Catholics in FSSP and, dare I say it, SSPX parishes. That's where your seminarians are coming from, for the most part. 1% of them being progressives. If I was on their side of things, I would be very, very upset by this. There's more data here. Back to the article, quote, Ruth Graham wrote in the New York Times that, quote, today's young priests don't see themselves as a conservative insurgency, but as part of a new generation that embraces the teachings of the church instead of robbing them of importance, and what they see as a mistaken search for an evangelization of great reach. The priests and authorities interviewed by Ruth Graham last July 10th, that was after I reported on this story initially, corroborated the data of the November report. Brad Vermeulen, sociology professor at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, says that those ordained since 2010, quote, are clearly the most conservative seen in a long time, and that since 1980, each generation is more conservative than the previous one. He notes that the acceptance of, quote, secularism in the church also even softened the expectations in the ordination of women, premarital cohabitation, and appropriate dress for Mass, quote, in an attempt to make the church seem more welcoming and that her teachings be easier to accept. Many priests of the 1970s and 80s looked at the world and said, the world is changing and we need to change. The vision didn't work. There was a generalized loss of faithful and low practice of the faith. The numerous conversions during this year in the United States are attributed to young priests who are faithful, energetic, and willing to do anything, said Jason Whitehead, Director of Evangelization and Catechesis in the Diocese of Fort Worth. A study of the Episcopal Conference of the United States, published on April 15th, reported that half of the 400 seminarians about to be ordained this year are aged around 30, older than in the past. According to Whitehead, orthodoxy and fidelity to the gospel result in more converts. He himself, a convert and former Baptist, recalls his preparation to enter the Catholic Church, where he witnessed many abandoning the preparation, quote, because they were not given the truth of the gospel and the teachings of the church. End quote. I have worked in RCIA programs at Nova Sorto parishes in my distant past now. And I will tell you something. I was lucky that that parish, which is the parish I came into the church in, had a deacon who was, I would call, traditionally minded. Didn't get into ecclesiastical politics, the traditionalist versus not traditionalist arguments. He didn't care about any of that. He cared about Jesus Christ and his teachings and the teachings of the church. Now, some of you may see that as a contradiction. Having known the man, he was one of the holiest men I've ever been around. But not every parish has that. A lot of parishes use RCIA to teach you the bare minimum that the bishop requires or that the church requires, and then giving you the materialist false gospel instead. And those RCIA programs don't have a high success rate because people who want to enter the church are hungry for the gospel, or they're trying to placate their Catholic soon-to-be spouse so they can get married in the church. Saw plenty of that too. The more faithful to the gospel the parish is with its RCIA program, the more successful that RCIA program is. That's directly tied to this. Those parishes also tend to produce more vocations. Do you take this to be the good news that I do? Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Are you happy to see this story corroborated from other sources, including from academics who are noticing the same thing? And what do you think about where this is in the broader culture? Because I'm seeing the same kind of thing in the culture more broadly right now, that it's taking a more conservative turn. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And, as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.